Sometimes all you want out of a unit is a wrecking ball, and the Knight Gallants might just be one of the scariest wrecking balls in all of 40k. Hello and welcome to Auspex Tactics, and welcome to the first video of Knight Fortnite. The 2 weeks on the channel where we're going to be having a new Imperial Knight video every day, and look into how best to crush the traitors and Xenos under the adamantium bulk of the Imperial Knights. To kick it off, we're going to look at one of the big Questoris pattern Knights, the Knight Gallant. Now, I've often seen this guy written off by other players who think that is too easily countered due to only being a melee monster without any other real options. But I'll be honest, I've had some good success running Knight Gallants myself. So let's go over a few of the combos that we can use with him. In this video, we'll look at the build of the Knight Gallant, how we can equip him with different relics and things, any ways that we can buff him up by using different houses and stratagems, and how I would personally try and run a Knight Gallant on the tabletop. In the background, Knight Gallants are some of the most impetuous and risk-taking of all the Imperial Knights, as well befits them armed only with close combat weapons. To be a Knight Gallant, you need to charge madly into the enemy's lines, not stopping to worry about personal safety or any other concerns of the battlefield, as you plunge forwards to crush the foe beneath your Reaper chainsword and adamantium feet. So let's see what these guys can do for us on the battlefield. A Knight Gallant has a fairly typical Questoris pattern stat line with a few minor differences. Its movement is 12, it has a boosted weapon skill of 2+, ballistic skill 3+, strength 8, toughness 8, 24 wounds, 5 attacks, so 1 more than normal, leadership 9, and a 3-up save. It degrades in a similar way to most Imperial Knights. Its movement drops to 9 when it's less than 12 wounds, and again to 6 when it's 6 wounds or less. The ballistic skill and weapon skill similarly degrade at these brackets, dropping to 3-up and then 4-up when you're on your lowest bracket for weapon skill, which means that these guys still hit fairly accurately even when they're on their lowest bracket, which is very nice. At base, the Gallant is armed with a Reaper chainsword, thunderstrike gauntlet, heavy stubber, and titanic feet, and it will cost you 352 points now the heavy stubber has come down in price a little bit. You have the option to trade the heavy stubber for a melter gun, which will set you back an additional 12 points, and you have the option to take one of the 3 carapace weapons, the Iron Storm missile pod, Storm Spear missile pod, and the twin Icarus autocannon. Typically, I'd usually choose to just field a Gallant with no upgrades, and just be 352 points of close combat rage. I can see the option for trading the heavy stubber for a melter gun. As the Gallant is likely to be getting so close to the enemy, you'll be more likely to use it than ever before. But honestly, I'm not sure how often it's going to come up that a single melter shot is going to make the difference. If you're already within 12 inches of heavy targets, then you'll generally be charging them, and hopefully killing them in close combat. And even if you're not, then it's unlikely that one additional melter shot is actually going to make the difference between you either killing a target or not. So I generally prefer the heavy stubber just to have some ranged option, and hopefully gun down a couple of light infantry who might be important on objectives. I generally don't like to take the carapace weapons quite as much on this guy, because I'll often be wanting to advance him to get him into close combat, and if you're slowing his speed to take advantage of a small carapace weapon, then you might actually be hurting yourself if you're hurting the chance of him getting into melee. I can however see the argument for something like the Storm Spear missile pod, as it's so strong that it's almost like a primary weapon for one of the Knight's arms. If you take this, then your Gallant goes up to 397 points, which is cheaper than, say, a Knight Warden. Retains a good gun and retains the boosted melee profile of the Gallant, so it's certainly an option. All of the carapace weapons become a lot more viable in House Raven as well, because you can happily advance and still shoot with them at full power. So it might well be worth throwing on some Iron Storm missile pods if you are Raven, even if you're planning to advance your Gallant a lot to try and get it into close combat as quick as possible. The model has a few special rules as per most Imperial Knights. It has an Ion Shield for a 5-up invul save against shooting, which of course you can rotate for 1 command point to become a 4-up invul save. It has the standard very big explosion for the Imperial Knights, which if you roll a 6 when it's destroyed, everything within 2d6 inches suffers d6 mortal wounds. This is particularly useful for a Gallant if you pay the 2 command points to have the higher chance of exploding it. It will often have reached the middle of the enemy army by the time it goes down, so it's often worth doing this to detonate all over as many enemy units as you possibly can. And finally, it has the standard super heavy walker rule, which means it can fall back in the movement phase and still shoot and charge and it can step over enemy infantry and swarm models to do this. So overall, the Gallant is an absolute close combat blender. Those 5 attacks and the 2-up weapon skill means that it will be hitting with a lot of horrendously strong attacks, and it should be pretty decent at damaging whatever unit is put in its way, whether that's infantry with the stomps, or harder targets with the gauntlet or chainsword. In general, you'll be wanting to throw this guy straight towards the enemy lines and see what happens. But now let's have a look at the different ways that we can buff this guy to get the most out of him. Firstly, you have House Turin, whose benefit is called Gallant Warriors, which is a little bit of a clue as to what this house might be good at. The household bonus is that you can roll an additional d6 whenever you advance and charge, and discard the lowest result of the roll. This is just out and out amazing on a Gallant, because it will really get him where he needs to go, and reduces your chance of failing a key charge. Extra movement is exactly what the Gallant wants, so it's a great house for Gallants. But it gets even better because their stratagem is almost specifically geared towards Gallants. Glory in Honour is a 3 command point stratagem and will let your Gallant fight again in the fight phase. So at base that will usually be 10 attacks worth of Gallant, so 30 stomps, or 10 Reaper Chainsword attacks, and all of this is hitting on 2s, so it'll be hilariously damaging. Paying 3 CP to fight again with about one of the most destructive forces in all of 40k is generally going to be worth it, but obviously it's best if you have a lot of command points available, say with some guard or admech allies to provide some command points. If you're thinking about running a full lance of Gallants, so 3 Gallants in an army list, you'd really want to be thinking about House Terran, because they are probably the single best house for Gallants. Though admittedly they don't tend to do quite as much for the other types of knight if you are thinking of mixing a few different types in one army. House Griffiths also isn't a bad one for a knight Gallant. It gives them +1 attack on the charge, so increases their damage output a little bit. It also lets them heroically intervene as if they were a character, which could be useful, but usually your knights will be characters anyway because of relics and warlord traits. It's not bad, but I think I prefer House Terran on the whole. House Hawkshroud will keep it up and fighting for a little bit longer due to it not degrading as badly. I don't think it's the ideal one for the Gallant though, as it doesn't degrade too badly as we discussed earlier. It'll still be hitting you on a 4-up even on its lowest bracket. House Cadmus has rerolls of 1 against anything that's 12 wounds or less while in the fight phase, so can buff your Gallant's damage a tiny bit. House Morton can add 1 to your hit rolls in the fight phase, which isn't actually that great on Gallants because they already have a 2-up to start with, so they don't really need this. House Raven could be good for advancing and still firing carapace weapons as we mentioned. House Tyrannus has a 6-up Feel No Pain, so will make your Gallant tougher over the course of a battle, and that's certainly worth considering. House Crast is a good one for Gallants because they will re-roll all failed hit rolls in the fight phase on a turn in which they charged or made a heroic intervention. So that's a solid combat buff, and it's particularly good if your Gallant takes damage, as you'll be re-rolling a lot of 1, 2s and 3s if your Gallant is close to death. And for House Volk is a bit of a shooting based buff, so it isn't quite so good for Gallants. So overall my top picks for selecting your knight Gallant would be House Terran if you're running purely Gallants, and I'd think about Griffiths, Crast or Tyrannus if you're running a bit more of a mixed knights force. Particularly Crast and Tyrannus are my favourite houses overall, due to the other benefits that they can get. Let's take a bit of a look at relics and warlord traits next, and Gallants are a really good unit to be able to tailor slightly to your opponent based on what you're facing. So after you've seen the opponent's army list, you're allowed to use the stratagem to select additional relics, and this can give you some good control over how you want to tool your Gallant up to fight against the foe. By far my top pick for the warlord traits for Gallants would be Landstrider, which is add 2 to all advance and charge rolls of your unit and any friendly household units within 6 inches of this warlord. Now this will add 4 inches to your threat range on any turn that you advance and charge, and that's perfectly possible because of the full tilt stratagem that we'll mention in a second. When you use this combo, your Gallant's average threat range is 26.5 inches if you move, advance and charge with Landstrider up. This can really catch opponents out as they think that their units are easily safe from a Gallant's charge from about this distance, and even if they're slightly further away, you can still have an attempt for it, and you can think about using command rerolls to further buff your movement. Entire games can swing on whether your Gallant makes the charge or not, so this is usually my default pick if the opponent doesn't look like they're going to be coming towards me. If they are going towards me, then I'd think about something to buff the Gallant's damage output, so something like Knight Seneschal, which adds +1 to your attacks characteristics, so just makes it a bit choppier in close combat, or Blessed by the Sacristans, which allows you to inflict a mortal wound each time you roll an unmodified wound roll of a 6, and I'd often put this on the Gallant's Titanic feat. You'll be making loads and loads of rolls with that, so you should on average get about 2 extra mortal wounds per fight phase, which is pretty good in terms of buffing the Gallant's damage ability against hordes or infantry. Now, relic choice is another way that you can really tailor your Gallant's loadout. If you're fighting against other enemy big things or other knights, then there's really no reason not to take the Paragon Gauntlet, which is an incredibly strong relic. The Paragon Gauntlet upgrades your standard thunderstrike gauntlet to have no negative penalty to hit, so you'll still be hitting on 2s, and makes its damage characteristic jump to 8, which is pretty hilarious to be honest. This means against standard knights you only need to get 3 hits through to one-shot the knight in a round of close combat, which is certainly possible. Provided you can get the charge with a Gallant with a Paragon Gauntlet, then you have a very, very good chance of, even if you don't kill the knight, you should do horrendous damage to it, particularly if you feed it a command reroll to reroll a failed wound or something. Sanctuary can be a very, very good pick for a Gallant, say if you're going up against an army that has lots of fighty HQ characters in it, and you're worried about your Gallant getting hit by Power Claws or Thunderhammers or the like. Being able to have a 5-up in close combat that you can make into a 4-up by rotating Iron Shields can allow your Gallant to survive and then hit back very hard with its own combat weapons. I don't take this enough when I really should, and I need to remember it more. A different style of defensive buff, the Armour of Sainted Ion, to give your Gallant a 2-up save, can be incredibly useful in some matchups. If you look at your opponent's army and it's mainly got AP-2 shooting or AP-1 shooting, then this can essentially save you from having to bother rotating Iron Shields, as your armour save will be good enough on its own. If you're using a Questor Imperialis house, you can also consider the Helm of the Nameless Warrior, which also gives you +1 attack, and there's also the option of the Ravager, which is a boosted Reaper chainsword, but in my opinion I think that on the Gallant this is flatly outclassed by the Paragon Gauntlet. Between the Paragon Gauntlet and the Knight Stompy feat, there's not really any room that you'd use the Ravager on virtually any targets, but if you were running multiple Gallants then you could consider it. So now we're on to stratagems, and oh boy do Gallants have a lot of options. As with all knights, consider using Rotate Iron Shields to buff that Iron Shield to a 4-up invul. As we mentioned before, Full Tilt is an incredibly important one for a Knight Gallant, as it will allow you to advance and then charge, and that one costs 2 command points. This is something I'd almost always consider doing first turn if you have the first turn with the Knight Gallant to allow it to crash straight into the enemy lines on turn 1. When you just fought with a Gallant, I'd certainly consider if you're going to use either Thunderstomp or Death Grip, which are both little mortal wound causing stratagems that can finish off a character or an injured model that's very, very close to the knight. Death Grip is amazing on characters. It costs 1 command point. You pick a 1 model unit, which is often a character, and you have to roll an attack to hit with your Thunderstrike Gauntlet to attack that character, which will usually be hitting on a 3+. That character then takes D3 mortal wounds, and then it has to roll to try and escape from your Death Grip by rolling off and adding their strength against you rolling off and adding your strength. For most low strength characters, this means that the character will only ever escape if they roll a 6. In the FAQ, it says that if they roll a 6 then they just automatically escape, but otherwise each time they fail they'll take a further D3 mortal wounds. Now this stratagem easily has the ability to one-shot a character from 4 wounds down to no wounds, provided you don't get unlucky and either miss your attack or the opponent rolls a 6. I would certainly consider this at the end of each fight phase if there are any high value enemy characters nearby. It's only 1 command point. Thunderstomp on the other hand is a bit less reliable. You choose an enemy infantry or swarm model that is within 1 inch of the knight, and on a 4-up the enemy suffers D3 mortal wounds. This one's more worth it if you just need to finish off that extra 1 or 2 wounds left that's on a fighty character, or you desperately need to kill 1 last infantry model this turn. It's not a very efficient use of command points, but if that model's about to strike back and potentially kill your knight, then it could always be worth it. Chain Sweep is a worthwhile option if you're absolutely surrounded with enemy infantry. You roll a d6 for every single model that's within 3 inches of your knight, and on a 6 each one suffers a mortal wound. In general, this is only ever going to be worth it if you're surrounded by an absolute ton of infantry, say 30+, as typically models that come in any sort of horde are really quite cheap and aren't always worth the price to pay for spending a command point on a few mortal wounds on them. Machine Spirit Resurgent is another great stratagem if you are a Mechanicus knight. This for 1 command point will let you use the top damage profile, so he'll still be hitting on 2s and will have one last turn of murderizing your opponent, even if he's critically damaged. On the other side, if you're a Quest or Imperialist knight, then you will have the option to Valiant Last Stand, which will cost 2 command points, where the knight can fight one last time before it dies. This is enormously powerful, as a single round of combat from the Gallant can kill an awful amount of stuff, even when it's maximally degraded as it will be then. You'll still get to hit on 4-ups, so that's going to be the equivalent of 7 stomps hitting an opponent, or around about 2 to 3 Reaper Chainsword hits. It could easily drag down whatever killed it. But talking of dragging down whatever killed it, let's talk about Noble Sacrifice, probably my favourite stratagem in the Knight book. For 2 command points, you can cause the Imperial Knight to explode on the roll of a 4-up. This is so worth considering for a Gallant because, as I said before, you're quite likely to have charged right into the midst of your enemy. Having a 2d6 inch range explosion will generally get a whole bunch of very important enemy units in its range, so you could hand out an enormous amount of mortal wounds to the enemy, which might have been more than the Gallant even did when it charged in the first place. If you think your Gallant is going down in the midst of the enemy army, then save some command points for this and ensure you have a command reroll spare this turn to reroll the dice if it's not a 4-up. Even at best this will only happen 3/4 of the time, but you can win a game right by doing that manoeuvre, as by killing a bunch of characters or damaging a bunch of very tough units you could deal the opponent a blow that he can't recover from. So now we've talked about all the ways that we can buff our Knight Gallant, how would I run one personally on the battlefield? As I said, I would like to adjust the Gallant to my opponent by buying in the relics and warlord traits with the stratagem after I've seen the army. I'd almost always take Landstrider to ensure I have a good chance of hitting the enemy battle line turn 1, and then I would either take the Armour of Sainted Ion for better defence, Sanctuary for better defence against fighty characters or other knights, or the Paragon Gauntlet if there's a lot of big stuff, particularly against other knights, as it has the ability to one-shot other knights on the charge. I'd deploy my Gallant fairly far up in the deployment zone, and from there I would see whether or not I can get a first turn charge. If I can, I would probably go for that, as even if the Gallant only has to kill a unit of infantry and then the entire enemy's army goes and charges and kills the Gallant, then there'd be a good chance that I'd have a huge explosion to deal out to all of the enemy units, and by forcing them to focus on the Gallant so much, they would have hopefully left my other knights relatively unscathed turn 1. If I didn't have first turn, or I couldn't get the first turn charge, I'd consider screening my Gallant behind friendly allies if I had them. I particularly like to hide my Gallant behind a couple of walls of guardsman infantry, so if you're facing something else that has a nasty melee threat, say if you're facing down another Gallant on the other side of the table, they will hopefully come charge in and kill the guardsman, and then you'll be able to counterattack in return, get the charge, and hopefully deal the other knight a knockout blow. The same sort of thing applies to things such as Lord Discordance, or any other big nasty melee threat that's coming to kill you. I try and be mindful about all the stratagems that I can use in close combat, particularly Death Grip and Thunderstomp are not ones to forget, as if you can spend a command point or 2 to crush an enemy character that would be otherwise annoying you for the rest of the battle, then you should certainly do so. In terms of fighting with your Gallant in close combat, it's important to choose which weapon profile to attack with each time. Against almost all targets, the adamantium feet are actually going to be the best option. Certainly anything that's infantry and you're wounding on a 2-up with those feet will generally be the best way to go. The gauntlet and the chainsword are usually better against big things such as vehicles or other knights. The gauntlet tends to beat the chainsword on anything that's toughness 8 and doesn't have an invul save, and the chainsword tends to be better that's anything that's toughness 7 and does have an invul save. Bear in mind that both the gauntlet and the chainsword are quite swingy. You have a reasonably high chance of ludicrously overkilling your intended target, but you also have a reasonably high chance of absolutely whiffing and only doing, say, 6 damage out of all of your attacks. So sometimes you might just want to go for the Thunderstomp feat for reliability. Particularly when I'm fighting against a character with a Storm Shield, for example, I will usually typically use the feat, as it will force a whole bunch of saves, and some are more likely to get through that 3-up invul save when they could just laugh off an entire round of combat if you fight with the chainsword or the gauntlet. I find knight gallants to be an amazing distraction carnifex. When I'm fielding a gallant alongside my other knights, it will about 2 times out of 3 be the first knight that gets destroyed, which is quite funny considering it's the cheapest knight out of the lot. This is really good from an army-wide perspective, as you force your opponent to shoot at something that's equally durable, but isn't actually anywhere near as many points as say your Knight Crusaders, and they could actually afford to ignore for a turn or two. Just having that horrendously scary melee profile is something that makes people really panic. In terms of countering the Knight Gallant, one of the most effective ways is to move block it with an infantry squad, as it can't actually walk directly over an infantry squad in the movement phase, it can only do it when it falls back. One of the easiest ways is just to have an Imperial Guard infantry squad and give them the order move, move, move. If they can move to a position where they're just in front of the Knight Gallant, then that Knight Gallant will essentially be going nowhere next turn, and the only thing it will be able to kill is a 40-point infantry unit, which is usually a good trade for having it not reach your lines. Also, anything that can slow movement, such as a Thunderfire Cannon's tremor shells, I believe, can stop this guy from getting anywhere near the enemy lines, so is a pretty solid counter to a melee-only monster. So overall, my opinion is that the Knight Gallant can definitely be used in a competitive 40k setting, though it does obviously have some downsides and potential counters. I've been having good results with mine on the battlefield, and I will be continuing to use it in my knights lists going forwards. As always, if you think I've missed anything or you have any other ideas or tactics for using the Knight Gallant, please post them down below, and if I've got any rules wrong, please correct me. Thank you very much for listening to another Auspex Tactics review. I'm looking forward to churning out a whole bunch of knight videos over the next couple of weeks. Tomorrow we'll be taking a look at the different ways that we can field knights and the detachment benefits that we can get from fielding them in each way. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you guys in the next video.